There was just so much going on last week. Okay, yeah.
It's hot.
It's ready. It's going.
It's going. So be careful what you say.
Don't signal me when you turn it on.
It's on.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Maybe I'll leave it there until I'm ready for it.
Okay.
Morning. This one is. This one I think is.
Yeah.
This one's kind of air treated. Kind of construction that has two or three was up top. I guess
That's it.
I'm gonna be like a gunslinger.
There you go.
Well, hey, how are you? Good. Hey, how are you? Good. How are you doing?
Trying to clear everything out of your way before. Otherwise, we'll be moving chairs while you're all distracted. Thanks.
I'm just glad the rain stopped.
I know. It's pretty nice out. It's pretty.
It is Jason. Josh. Josh. Oh, sorry. Josh. Jeffrey came in 5 minutes ago and said, you got 5 minutes. I gotta be careful, I'm gonna get fired.
Start a third round here.
Oh, thank you.
This one's got stuff.
Oh, my goodness. They both, several. We'll take care of that
Okay.
outside. Okay, I think that is it.
Nice.
Oh, this is it. Praise God.
Close that door, your live stream.
Good morning. I'm on the speaker this morning because we're live streaming, so I have to really be careful what I say. Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Fabian, and today we're going to be talking about Paul, Augustine, and the growing church. What is the matter? Okay. I think we are now ready. I should apologize for thinking that I could do Paul and Augustine in 45 minutes. So we're going to really zip through and really touch lightly on some of their major contributions. To repeat from last week, we're doing 4 weeks on kind of a crash course in theology. Last week we did nascent Christianity with Jesus. Today it's growing Christianity with Paul and Augustine, who will explain it all for us. Next week things get a little dicey because we're going to be doing Luther Shakes Things Up. Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and his band of crazy people. And then finally, the moment we've all been waiting for, the Anglican settlement Henry VIII and Elizabeth I hammer it all out for us. So let's just launch right in. What was St. Paul's theology? St. Paul's theology can kind of be summarized by his approach to the incarnation, the covenant, the kingdom, and universal salvation. Now again, as I said last week, if we brought 10 theologians in here, and I think we sort of have one now, at least that I know about, they would all disagree with me. So I make no apologies. This is my take on Paul. Incarnation, Paul's theology of the incarnation was really the epicenter of his entire theology. Incarnation comes from the Latin word carne, which means flesh. It's a very visceral term, that God would come into the flesh, that God would take flesh. In the ancient world, the concept of flesh was a very guttural, visceral term. Flesh was what was corruptible. Flesh decomposed. The idea that the eternal, unchanging God would take flesh was a kind of crazy idea. Paul tells us that Jesus is God incarnate, and we see in Paul the incarnation. This little thing has a whole lot of buttons, and I'm always hitting the wrong one. The incarnation, we see Jesus of Nazareth that we saw depicted in the Gospels is now moving to the cosmic Christ. Paul talks about the cosmic Christ. We overcome sin through the incarnation and our union with Christ. Again, we were raised with all of this, so we kind of nod our heads and say, yeah, that makes sense. But it was kind of a revolutionary concept 2,000 years ago. Certainly there had been Jewish mystics who had explored the idea of union with God, but Paul kind of brings it into a new realm with this whole idea of union with Christ. Christ's sacrifice on the cross overcomes sin. That was sort of hinted at in the gospel stories and in the teachings of Jesus, but he never specifically said, my sacrifice on the cross will overcome sin, not only for you, but for the world. We're going to talk about Paul's concept of the old covenant, because Paul brings in this concept of a new covenant. Covenant is another word for testament, so the New Testament is the new covenant. Paul tells us that righteousness is impossible outside of the Jewish covenant, the covenant between the people of Israel and God. A covenant is an agreement, and in the Old Testament and the laws of the Old Testament, we have this covenant. I will be your people, you will be my God. If you keep the covenant, I will bless you. And throughout the Old Testament, we have the prophets saying, the reason everything is going wrong is we didn't keep the covenant. We turned our backs on God. God has abandoned us. This is why, and here we can fill in the blank, this is why the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Romans have conquered us and have, come in and messed up our whole situation here. The Old Covenant centers on laws and rules, such as the dietary law and circumcision. Circumcision was the sign of the covenant in the Old Testament. Therefore, righteousness is impossible for Gentiles who do not follow these rules and do not get circumcised. Oh, there we go. Back. Okay. Now, Paul brings in this whole idea of a new covenant. There's now a new covenant. We did not really see that in in the teachings of Jesus, but it's right there in Paul. Christ brings a new covenant, and it's not based on adherence to laws and rules. It's based on faith. Now, Paul would be quick to point out that if you have faith, you will follow the rules. But the faith is the center of it. And we're going to see next week, Luther returns to this idea that the whole covenant is based on faith. The whole concept of salvation is based on faith. The new covenant is forged by Christ's death, resurrection, and second coming. That's the three-legged stool that Paul bases his theology on. The new covenant is about union with Christ through faith. This new covenant is available to all, even Gentiles, which again was, well, we'll talk about this when we get to universal salvation in just a couple minutes. But that was kind of Paul's kind of inclusiveness was very revolutionary. No religion in those days was inclusive. If you were a member of the cult of Isis, only the members of the cult of Isis were going to be saved. Now, it's kind of interesting, and I'm going to do a little sidebar here. It's kind of interesting that we have some kind of radical Christians these days who kind of basically believe that only their church is going to be saved. And by their church, I don't mean their congregation, I mean their community. I was once told by a Protestant minister, we were getting together an interdenominational gathering, and only one Baptist church out of the 900 in southern Mississippi participated. I said, why is only one Baptist church participating? He said, oh, we're Baptists. We don't even believe other Baptists are going to heaven. Just our church. So now we're still talking about the new covenant. Again, it's revolutionary. This is why sometimes we call Paul the architect of Christianity. He really kind of structured the religion in a lot of ways. What's interesting and kind of sad is that the doctrine of the new covenant hastened the schism between Christianity and Judaism, made it quickly impossible for Christians and Jews to be part of the same religion, which they had been up until around 200. You see Christianity is seen as a form of Judaism, but it quickly kind of dissipates because of the universal salvation idea. New Covenant 3, redemption. Christians are redeemed by Christ's death and resurrection. Again, we hear this term all the time, blessed Redeemer, we sing about it. But to step back and remind ourselves that the Greek word for redemption, and actually there were like 3 Greek words that they used for redemption, but the Greek word for redemption means specifically to be bought out of slavery, to be ransomed out of slavery. If you bought a slave's freedom, you were said to be their redeemer, to have redeemed them. And so this whole concept of redemption is literally to be freed from slavery. And Paul talks about this, that we are slaves to sin. Augustine's going to develop that a lot. Paul's idea of universal salvation also includes the notion of personal salvation. So it's Christ died for all, and more personally speaking, Christ died for me. The next topic we're going to hit, any questions at this point before we go any further? Okay, good. All right, kingdom. Paul has this theology of the kingdom. Now, certainly Jesus talked about the kingdom all the time, but Paul's idea of kingdom is a little different from the notion of kingdom that we see in Jesus. The kingdom centers on Christ's resurrection and second coming. And the reason Paul does this is because there's almost no difference between saying the kingdom is now and the kingdom is later, because for Paul, later is almost now. Jesus is coming back next week. He's coming back in another, if not next week, the week after that, maybe next month at the latest. Paul's whole notion, and it's a very active Christianity, we have to drop everything. We have to drop everything and go out and get new members and tell people about Christ, because he's coming back really quickly. And the only people who are going to be saved are the ones who already know about him. So with Paul, you get this very, very active, go out there and do it kind of Christianity. Jesus will return very soon. The dead in Christ will rise from the dead. Those living believers are going to be caught up into heaven, and the kingdom will appear at the end of days. But the end of days is very soon. So it's not, Paul's not saying Jesus is going to come again in 2,000 or 3,000 years. He's saying Jesus is coming back tomorrow. And so forget about, whatever it is you're thinking about your daughter's wedding, forget it. Forget it. You're planning a party? No, forget that party. You got to drop everything and go out there. And this is going to heavily influence Paul's notion of sexuality, as we'll see. I can't do Paul without at least addressing, was Paul a misogynist? It's a fair question. And the answer is, it's complicated. It's a complicated issue for Paul. Paul has said a lot of things. Now remember, Paul did not know he was writing the Bible. He was unaware that he was writing the Bible. We had the bishop here last week, and he said something really funny. He said, in his sermon, he said, when he talks about Paul quoting the Bible, he wasn't quoting our Bible. He was quoting the Old Testament. He wasn't quoting the Bible that he did not know he was writing. So, some of the things Paul says, and because of this, he's not making an effort to write a consistent theology. He's just writing letters. He's writing letters to friends. And some of the things he's saying are universal, timeless things that he would even acknowledge are universal. Other things are just like, hey, how's it going? Here you all are having a really rough time. You need to kind of shape up. I hear you're arguing a lot. Don't argue. Women, cover your heads. Like, what? So, some of the things he says. In Christ there is neither male nor female. He says this in Galatians. Revolutionary and very forward-thinking. Nobody, when you think that Paul was a citizen of Rome and a Jew, he calls us a Jew's Jew, I'm like really Jewish. He worked for the temple, we are led to believe. Neither in ancient Judaism nor in ancient Greco-Roman society did women have any rights. Let me back that up. The Romans actually gave women more rights than the Greeks did, which is sometimes surprising because we kind of think of the Greeks as being enlightened, philosophy, Plato, Socrates, and we think of the Romans as being kind of brutal, with the Colosseum and gladiators fighting to the death. But in ancient Rome, women could own property, and women could divorce their husbands. This was not the case in either Israel or in Greece at the time. Paul was influenced mostly by Israel and by Greek thought, and yet he says this, in Christ there is neither male nor female. Here he's speaking universally, he's speaking timelessly. He also says, women, stay silent in church. Personally, I don't think he was speaking universally here. I think maybe he had gotten the word that there was some woman who was talking in church all the time in Corinth. Because he only says this to the Corinthians. He does not say this in any of his other letters. And if that was a universal teaching, he might mention it again. He praises the deaconess Phoebe, which, again, we don't think much about it. It's in one of his letters. And he just mentions, I want to greet Phoebe the deaconess. The fact that he mentions that there is a deaconess named Phoebe is the basis upon which women have been ordained in our church and in all Christian churches. Because in the Bible, a woman is a deaconess. And a deacons were considered, they didn't really have ordination then, but deaconesses and priests at this time and bishops were kind of the hierarchy of the church. They were the leadership of the church. At this point, we really only have bishops. The word was episkopos, which means supervisor. And we had deacons. The job of the deacons was to care for the widows and to take care of the money. So again, I want to talk about sometimes he's speaking practically in some of his advice to the churches, and sometimes he's speaking from a point of view of values. In Christ, there's neither male or female is a value. Cover your head in church, stay silent in church is more something he was saying practically at the time. Now, sexually, he says, and this has to do with his belief that Jesus is coming back tomorrow. Marry if you must, but stay single if you can. He says, if you have to get married, it's okay, but I would prefer that you be like me. I am not married because I'm too busy. You don't have time to get married. You don't have time to have children. You don't have time to then have to take care of children. You have to drop everything and go out and get new members. That's what's important. There's work to do. Very interestingly, he says in 1 Corinthians, as regards virginity, I have no advice for you from the Lord. I only have, this is my own advice. He specifically makes the distinction. This is my idea. This is not from the Lord. He does mention that all the other, and he uses the phrase, all the other apostles are married, and that they travel with their wives. But he kind of looks down on that in a way, like they could probably be doing more work if they weren't traveling with their wives. He doesn't say that, but he implies it. So that's all we're going to do on Paul right now. Again, we could spend 3 months on Paul, but I just wanted to kind of talk about his contribution to our theology. Notice how the theology builds on the previous theology. We have the Old Testament, this notion of a God who talks to people and listens to them and has conversations with them, who appears to them in a burning bush, who is able to be argued with. We have the great story and a God who kind of lives within history and evolves. God destroyed the world in the flood. And after that was all over, he says, yeah, I'm not going to do that again. Next time it'll be fire. Curiously, then we have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where God says, I'm going to destroy Sodom because everybody's evil, and Lot argues with God. Come on. No, don't do that. How about if there's 100 good people? Would you spare Sodom if there were 100? If I could find 100 good people, and God's like, well, yeah, okay, I'll spare it for 100 good people. Lot comes back. He haggles with God. Okay, how about 50? How about 50? Would you spare it for 50 people? God says, yeah, okay. Lot comes back again. How about 10? Would you spare the city for 10? 10 good people would be worth sparing the city for. God acquiesces and says, yeah, I'll do it for 10. Now, the punchline of this ancient Jewish joke is that Lot couldn't find 10 good people, and God destroyed the city by fire, as he said he would. So we get this idea of the God who you can kind of argue with and who will change his mind. Now we move on to Jesus, the preacher. We have the theology in the Gospels of Jesus. He's usually referred to as Jesus, who is a preacher and a healer, and very accessible. People can come and talk to him. Then we move on to the sacrifice, the sacrificial Christ, the Lamb of God, the sacrificial Lamb, who dies a horrible death on the cross, is resurrected and brings this salvation. Now, what we're going to see in Augustine is a development from that. We're going to see a God who doesn't change his mind, a God who is eternal and unchanging and outside of time. So let's just launch into Augustine. Yes, come on. Yeah, okay. From Paul to Augustine. Now we've got 350 years difference here. And it's a big 350 years. By the time Augustine comes around, and Augustine is teaching around 400 AD, by that time, we've had the Council of Nicaea. Christianity has moved from being a small, somewhat illegal sect within Judaism. By 400 AD, Christianity is the official religion of the Roman Empire, which changes everything. Changes everything in good ways and in bad ways. God is now viewed through the lens of Greek philosophy. Christianity is the official religion of Rome. We now have a two-tiered society because the minute Christianity becomes the official religion, everybody's got to be Christian, even if you don't want to. So when Paul is writing, he's writing only to the people who have chosen to be Christian. So it's kind of an inside group. Augustine's writing for everybody. And by this time, you've got some people who are devout Christians who really believe in Jesus, and you've got a whole lot of people in the Roman Empire who are, well, this is the new official religion, I better sign up. And this becomes a real kind of identity crisis for the church, because how are we going to deal with this? The way the church deals with it is you have a two-tiered society. You have the people who are devout, and then everybody else who just has to be managed. We have to try to help these people get to the point where they want to be devout, but they're not there yet. So they're sneaking around doing their little pagan stuff, having their little pagan ceremonies. Some of those have come down to us today, like Christmas trees and, bringing greenery into the house in the winter and stuff like that. Those were the more harmless ones. Paul wrote to the devout, Augustine wrote to everyone. So this is going to kind of alter the way Augustine is writing. Those are Augustine's dates, 354 to 430 AD. Very different guy. Paul had been a Jewish anti-Christian activist before he became Christian. He was celibate. Augustine was a Greek philosopher and a member of a heretical cult, the Manichees. He was a man who, to put it very kindly, struggled with his chastity. And because of this is going to influence his attitude theologically towards sexuality. As I said last week, theology is always 33% autobiography, and Augustine's autobiography contributed to his ideas. in a big way. He converted while reading Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 13. So that's my little great segue from Paul into Augustine. Augustine was a member of the heretical sect for about 9 years. He joined when he was 18, took a mistress when he was 19, dumped her when he was 29 because she was from a lower class, even though he had a son with her, and then married a woman more in keeping with his class. And he became a bishop and a theologian. But this was after he converted to Christianity, to what was then Orthodox Christianity. He wrote extensively. He wrote over 100 books. He wrote 500 sermons, over 300 letters, and he kept all of them because unlike Paul, he knew he was writing theology. He was doing it intentionally. And so he was more careful about what he said. He didn't tell anybody to cover their heads or not to speak in church. He spoke more from a position, well, number one, from a position as a bishop, and from a position as a person who knew he was helping to form the thought of the church. He basically, this is titled, Why Should I Care? You might be wondering, this guy lived 1,600 years ago. Why should I care about him? Because he kind of wrote the book on Christian theology. So much of what we believe today is from Augustine. You might wonder, why am I calling him Augustine instead of Augustine? Augustine is the more British pronunciation. I grew up in New Orleans, and we had a high school there named St. Augustine's, and everybody called it St. Augustine, so that's how I pronounce it. I stand on firm ground here. He was probably in his life called Augustinus, and Augustinus is closer to Augustine than it is to Augustine. The Brits, for some reason, love to emphasize the second syllable on any Greek word. Really, think about it. It carries through. The way we articulate our faith, as I said, comes from Augustine. He gave us the notion of original sin. He coined that phrase, as a matter of fact. Original sin was his. Certainly it had been hinted at in Paul and some of the earlier theologians before Augustine, but he wrote the script on original sin. He gave us our concept of just war. We're not going to have time to talk about just war today, but it's a really interesting topic. If you remember back in 2003 when we were talking about invading Iraq, the members of Congress debated just war a lot. And he gave us, and he expanded Paul's teaching on grace dramatically. So let's jump in. Interestingly, and this is I find really fascinating, he opposed slavery. In 400 AD, he opposed slavery. He convinced, as bishop, he convinced all of his priests who owned slaves to release them. He wrote a letter to the emperor telling the emperor not to do away with slavery because he realized that was not going to fly, but telling the emperor to do away with child slavery. It was not uncommon at this time for a family, if you had 6 kids, to sell your oldest child into slavery because that was the only way the other 5 were going to survive. Slavery at that time was different than it was in the American colonies. It was not a lifelong thing. It was usually a temporary situation. You would sell yourself or you would sell your child into slavery for an X number of years. But I thought it was just really incredible that he was that far ahead of his time. He believed that Christians should lead simple lives He himself attempted to live a very simple life. Another interesting little tidbit about him is that he believed that the book of Genesis should be read symbolically. In 400 AD, this guy is saying, it didn't happen in 6 days. God did not create in 6 days. To be perfectly honest with you, though, he was wrong in the sense that he thought God created everything all at once. So today, we believe that it was a process that took a lot longer than 6 days. The good news, though, is that Augustine said that it should be looked at symbolically. The tree of life in the Garden of Eden was not a real tree. It was a symbol of the order of creation. We have so many Christian brothers and sisters who belong to fundamentalist churches who, up and down believe that it happened exactly the way it's described in Genesis. And sometimes we kind of think, oh, well, the fact that we believe it was all symbolic is kind of a very modern take on the whole story. It's not modern at all. Augustine was there 1,600 years ago. Let's jump into Augustine's original sin. It was caused by Adam and Eve's foolishness and pride. By eating the apple, whether you think it was a real apple or whether you think it was a symbolic apple, they brought sin into the world. And here's where, this is where we get specifically Augustinian. He says that original sin is passed down to our children through sexual intercourse. This is why, even though you are baptized and your original sin has been removed from you, your children are still born with original sin. You can't remove it. It's like in the DNA. And it's passed down like the DNA through sexual intercourse. This has all kinds of repercussions for everything, because this is why it's important for Jesus to be born of a virgin, because only by being born of a virgin can Jesus be sinless, can the Messiah be sinless. And it all kind of fits together. As we said last week, theologians take all of these little elements of faith and put them together and make a stew that we can now understand and we can eat and enjoy. Before Augustine, we had these little tidbits. We had a mention in the Bible that Jesus was born of a virgin. We had the idea of sin. Augustine puts it all together and explains how those two things are connected to each other. He uses the term concupiscence. Augustine, by this time, is writing and speaking in Latin, and concupiscence is from the Latin concupiscentia. And this refers to the idea that we are driven to do evil. We are incapable on our own merit of not doing evil. I used to teach high school religion, and I always asked my students when we were talking about Augustine, how many of you think that there is something in us that attracts us to things that we know are wrong? How many of you think that we sometimes are attracted to do things because they're wrong? And so I ask you, how many of you think we are attracted to do the wrong thing? Okay, a couple people are, you can put your hand up a little higher. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Many people today disagree with it. Many theologians today say there is no original sin, that we should be focusing on original blessing. We should have a doctrine of original blessing from God rather than a doctrine of original sin. But it does kind of help explain. And again, how does Augustine explain original sin? His own life. He goes back to his autobiography again. He says that when he was about 16 or 17, he and his friends climbed over a wall into an old man's garden where there was a pear tree. And they stripped the tree of all its pears and threw them over the wall and climbed over the wall. Now he explains to us he was not hungry. He said, we were not hungry. We didn't need the pears. We just did it because it made us feel bad. Or it made us feel good to do bad. And once again, he's using his autobiography. By the way, we know all about his autobiography because he was also the first person in history to write a tell-all autobiography. Augustine's Confessions. And even like English majors will admit that he basically pioneered the art of memoir writing. He introduced this radical dependence on grace. We are radically dependent on grace. Paul talked about God's grace and said that, we need God's grace, but Augustine says that, number one, evil is the corruption of good, and we are absolutely incapable of being good through our own effort. Absolutely incapable of doing good and being good unless we have God's grace. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, come on, Michael, I know several very good atheists. I know several people, some of them maybe in my family, who are really good people. They donate to the poor, they volunteer their time, and they're atheists. They don't believe in grace. Augustine's answer to you would be, because God knows everything, and God knows the future, he knows that those friends of yours who are good atheists are going to eventually convert. And because of that, he extends grace to them to do the right thing. I don't know if I totally agree with that, but that's how Augustine answers that question for you. It's an interesting concept, and it's something that's worth spending a little time meditating on or thinking about, this idea of depending on God's grace. We need God's grace. Grace alone enables us to be good people. So we're finishing up here. He wrote the Confessions, I mentioned. He also wrote a book called City of God. And this, again, was kind of provoked by his autobiography and by what was happening. In 410, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths. It was the first time in 800 years that Rome had been conquered. 800 years. After the sacking of Rome, many felt that, see, we converted all, we made Christianity the official religion of the empire, and we're attacked by Visigoths. The old gods have abandoned us, and the new gods are not, this new God is not protecting us. So Augustine felt compelled to address that. He says that happiness is unattainable because we are in a fallen world because of original sin. And happiness can only exist in heaven. The kingdom will only be established in the final days, but we don't know when that's going to be. Now, by this time it's 400 AD, it's clear that Jesus is not coming tomorrow or the next day, but he's coming sometime. And so the City of God was Augustine's attempt to say to people like, yeah, the Visigoths attacked us. God had nothing to do with that. God did not let that happen. It's because the world has fallen. We can't expect the world to be a good place where you can be happy. Now you can see what's happening here is theology is getting a little twisted because Jesus was all about let's build the kingdom now. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. By Augustine, it's kind of like, yeah, that's not going to happen because look around you. People are getting killed, pillaged, raped, murdered. Horrible things are happening. Happiness will only come in heaven. He also introduced to us the idea of body, and well, he didn't introduce it. He got it from Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy has an idea of dualism, and Augustine talks about the body and soul. Now, we buy into this. We all think of ourselves as a body and a soul. Augustine says that we are not our body. We are souls that are in possession of a body. The body is just something we carry around with us. Who we are is our soul. The purpose of the soul, not the purpose, but the job of the soul, is to control the sensual desires and passions of the body. Many modern theologians completely disagree with this, and Paul didn't believe in this, really. Paul didn't think of us as souls and bodies. The more modern idea is that we are a unitive being, that our soul and our body are fused together into one entity. It's wrong to think of it in two terms. But some people still adhere to this, and we talk about it all the time. We kind of accept the idea of souls and bodies. But to give you an example, St. Paul, in referring to Christ's resurrection, he said it was so the physical body was raised a spiritual body, not a soul, not separate from the body, but a spiritual body. And finally, the just war. I'm not going to go into this very much, but Augustine said that Christians should be pacifists, but sometimes war is inevitable. He gives a couple of criteria. It should be a war of defense. Civilians must not be targets. Later on, other theologians are going to add more criteria to it. That's where we get the just war theory. It was kind of important because in 400, with the Visigoths attacking, Rome had to either defend itself or not. And now Christianity is the official religion. Soldiers traditionally up until this time could not be Christians. If you converted as a soldier, you had to get out of the army because it was against the rules for a Christian to be a soldier. Augustine says, okay, that's not going to fly. We got to work this out. So he comes up with the just war theory, which really does make sense. I mean, you look at what would have happened in the 1940s if we had not been willing to engage in a just war. So consider the development from Paul to Augustine, how the idea of God changed, how the idea of sexuality changed. Some of this, even grace changed. Some of it was small changes. Some of it was pretty radical. I know we're late. Any thoughts or questions? Oh, we're not late. We're just on time. Good for me. I couldn't see the clock from where I was standing. Any questions or thoughts?
Did everybody take on his beliefs after he wrote this, or was it just kind of thought as an interesting idea within all Christianity?
Did everyone take on Paul's beliefs after he wrote this, or was it just viewed as an interesting opinion, right? Great question, excellent question. Christianity was was not centralized at all at this point. He was a bishop in the town of Hippo, so he really only had jurisdiction over his town. There was no pope at this time. At this time, the Bishop of Rome was kind of making noises that he should be in charge of everything, but most people were ignoring that. I would say by around 500, Augustine is generally accepted. He really was brilliant, and he made very good arguments, and his ideas just kind of worked their way into the fabric of Christianity. He will be pretty much, his ideas will control or dominate Christian thinking until the 1200s, when St. Thomas Aquinas comes along and kind of adds a whole lot of stuff, changes a whole lot of stuff. primarily because Augustine was a Platonist. He believed in Plato, and so his theology is based on the philosophy of Plato. St. Thomas Aquinas comes along, and by this time, Plato has fallen out of favor, and Aristotle is in favor. So St. Thomas Aquinas is going to reinterpret a lot of Christian doctrine based on Aristotelian ideas and thoughts. But up until that time, and then actually Augustine comes back in the Protestant Reformation because the Protestant reformers, although they are not Greek philosophers at all, they are more accepting of Plato. To give you an example, C.S. Lewis, we all know C.S. Lewis, theologian and novelist. In writing in the 1940s, C.S. Lewis was basically a Platonist. He had studied philosophy and he really liked Plato. He thought Plato was more Christian than Aristotle, that Plato's philosophy lends itself to Christian concepts better than Aristotle. So we're still, it has been said that Plato wrote the book on philosophy, and every philosophy since then is merely the footnotes to Plato. You can kind of go out on a limb and say Augustine wrote the book on Christian theology, and everything since then has been the footnotes to Augustine. I'm kind of going out on a limb. I'm really going out on a limb and saying that, but I think there's some truth there. Good question, though. Anything else? Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Great audience.